several rules of thumb when you're thinking about your drinks. One is minimize fluids with your meal. And usually we don't do that. We sit down and we have our food and we have a big glass of something to drink with the meal. The reason why that's not the best is because you tend to wash your food down. And so if you're going to have something to drink with your meal, fine, have a small amount, 4 ounces or less, rather than a large amount with your meal. So minimize fluids with meals. That's number one. And number two, it's best to avoid calories between meals. And you say, well, then there isn't much for me to drink if I'm going to minimize calories between meals and not have a lot with my meal. But you'll notice the drinks that Cheryl demonstrated are very low in calorie, and so they're fine for between meals. And if you have it with a meal, you just have a small amount. And chew your food thoroughly, because digestion needs to start in the mouth. Anything that you don't chew in your mouth has to be chewed below. As I mentioned, the first 2 guidelines are minimize fluid with meals, ideally not more than 4 ounces, and number 2, it's best to avoid calories between meals. We are not grazers, although many people talk about grazing. Those animals are called ruminants, and they are like cattle that have multiple stomachs and they chew their cud. And if we have calories between meals, we tend to reflux like the cows do, and that's not good for our esophagus. So you want to minimize those calories between meals. One more guideline, and that is don't try to drink with your mask on. It doesn't work too well. I've thought about maybe coming up with a way that you could slip a straw through a mask or have a valve, because I noticed when I'm at work, I don't drink as much water as usual because I've got this mask on, and then I have to wear goggles over my eyes, and in order to keep those from fogging up, I have to tape the mask across. And then when you go to drink something, you have to flip the mask up, and then it goes over your eyes because it's taped and you can't see what you're drinking, and so I don't get enough fluid. So take your mask off, but not when you're at work, I guess. So let's talk about some of the things that people drink and probably shouldn't. The first is soft drinks, and generally speaking, soft drinks you just don't want to partake of. Why is that? Because whatever you drink should improve your health and not impair it. In order to improve your health, you have to have something good in it. And with soft drinks, there's not much good in them. I have a friend who heard that I was giving this lecture tonight, and he said, "Tell the people not to do what I did when I was growing up." I said, "What's that?" He said, "I drank a liter of cola every day." Cola soda. And I said, "Well, what happened?" He said, "Well, all my teeth rotted out." And that's because cola has phosphoric acid in it, and that's hard on the enamel on your teeth. And it also has the sugar, and sugar, of course, as we know, causes cavities. So you want to avoid the soda whenever possible. Now, if you have one once in a while, I'm sure that won't hurt you too much. But generally speaking, soda is not good for us to consume. You say, well, what about artificially sweetened soda? Interestingly, when the mouth tastes sweet, it telegraphs to the brain that calories are coming. And if the calories don't appear, it makes you hungrier. And so you go and you have a meal and you think, well, I'm going to do myself a favor and I'm going to drink a soda that doesn't have any sugar in it, it's artificially sweetened, and you find that you end up eating more calories than if you hadn't had that soda. So even the artificially sweetened drinks sodas are not good for us either. So avoid sodas whenever you can. That's certainly going to be better for you. And you say, well, what about juice? If you look at juices on a volume basis with soda, the calories are about the same. The problem is if you juice an apple, you remove all the fiber. If you get a chance to look at a container of juice like orange juice and look at the fiber content, it's very, very low. And if you don't have the fiber there, then the sugars absorb very rapidly, and it will do to your body almost the same as soda will. So generally speaking, juices should, when they're consumed, should be consumed in small quantities and not between meals either. So I don't recommend large amounts of juice. It's much better to eat the fruit, particularly if you're trying to lose weight. And that's even more true of juices that have sugar added to them. Those particularly we should try to avoid. Another category of things that we drink are smoothies. Those are quite popular now. You take various constituents. You can take fruit and spinach and protein powder and all sorts of things and add it into a high-powered blender and switch it on, and then you have a smoothie. And you know, they can taste really, really good. I love the smoothies that I've eaten. But there are several things that you want to recognize. Number one, smoothies are particularly good for people without teeth. If you eat them, you tend to overeat because your body has this, your brain actually has a little counter, and it counts the number of times you chew. And if you chew enough, you get full. But if you just drink your calories straight down and don't chew them, you tend to overeat. Which means smoothies are really good if you're having a problem with being too thin. If you're trying to gain weight, smoothies are a good way to get your calories in. If you don't have teeth or are too thin, they're a great way to go. Otherwise, it's probably best to chew your food, unless you're one of those people that's just in a terrible rush and you don't have time to eat a good meal, and so you just drink it down on the way out the door to work. I suppose smoothies would be fine for that, although generally speaking it would be much better to take the time to sit down and have a more relaxed meal. So while I think smoothies taste great and they get a lot of positive press, I think you're better off usually to chew your food rather than drink it. That brings us to another category, and that's what about caffeinated drinks? I sort of skipped over that with soda and just mentioned the sugar. And so what about caffeinated drinks? Well, there's several things, first of all, before we get to the caffeine itself, that you need to do. When you're about to drink that cup of whatever it is, whether it's coffee or tea or a energy drink or hot chocolate, ask yourself how much sugar, how much fat, and then how much caffeine, because there's much more in a cup of coffee than just coffee beans. There's the creamer, and those creamers, I looked at one today. It was an oat milk creamer, and it had a tremendous amount of sugar in it, and it was very rich in fat as well. Now, I think it would probably make the drink taste very good, but generally speaking, it would not be good for you, particularly if you were having it between meals. You want to look at your waistline and check and see how your blood sugar is running, and then think twice about the amount of calories that are actually in that caffeinated beverage. Once you've asked yourself about that, then you of course look at caffeine. And the first thing is to be aware of how much caffeine is in a drink. If it's black tea, there's about 47 milligrams of caffeine in a cup of black tea. Green tea is actually the lowest. There's about 30 milligrams of caffeine in that. The average cup of coffee has about 95 milligrams of caffeine. And then you can go to Energy Shot. An Energy Shot has about 200 milligrams of caffeine in it, so that's the same as a little more than 2 cups of coffee. And that's quite a jolt. The question, of course, comes is caffeine good for you or bad for you? And the answer is probably both. I don't drink coffee as a regular habit. In fact, I haven't had any for about 15 years. I was driving, I finished work late one night, well, not that late, it was about 6:30, and then I had an emergency. I had to drive and visit my family in Maryland, and as I was going down the road, I got a little tired, and I stopped at a rest stop, and they had coffee there for free, and I thought, well, I've been up since 4 this morning, and here it is about 10 o'clock at night, and I still have another 4 hours to drive, and maybe a cup of coffee would help me. So I had a cup of coffee, and my children who were riding with me made me promise I'd never do that again. They said, "Dad, you talk nonstop for the next 4 hours." See, if you're not used to having coffee or caffeine, it really does have an effect on you. Now, whether that was good or bad, it depends. It was probably good because I stayed awake. It was bad because I kept everyone else awake. And that's a problem. But there have been studies with caffeine that show there are some benefits to it, particularly with Parkinsonism. This does not work for women, unfortunately, but the studies seem to show a marked decrease in the risk of Parkinsonism with caffeine intake. Now, before you run and grab your cup of caffeinated beverage to help reduce your risk of Parkinsonism, you need to ask yourself, well, what other causes are there to caffeine that we know about? Does it affect dementia? And it looks like it may reduce the risk of dementia as well. It may be not from the caffeine, but rather from the antioxidants in the coffee and in the green tea. If you look at American diets, the interesting thing is this. You find that the major source of antioxidants in the American diet is coffee. And that's astounding when you realize that fruit is packed with antioxidants and vegetables are packed with antioxidants. And here it is that coffee has such a big effect on the American diet. What it tells us is that we're eating really poor diets. And unfortunately, there have been no head-to-head trials between coffee and kale tea. And not that I recommend kale tea, although it probably wouldn't be bad for you. My point is, some of the benefits of coffee and caffeine may have to do with the antioxidants in them, and coffee is a very rich source of antioxidants, but I think it's probably not as good a source as regular food. It's interesting that 90% of Americans or more, at least 90% of Americans, consume caffeine in some form every day, which raises a question, and that is about the studies on coffee, tea, and caffeine in general. Where do you find a control group? And the only organization that's done really careful studies with control groups is Johns Hopkins University. And they recently published some studies on caffeine and its performance enhancing capabilities. For years, we felt that if you drink coffee, it improves your mental performance, it improves your physical performance. And what the studies at Hopkins showed is that it really does improve performance, both mental capacity and physical capacity, if you're a regular user. In other words, it helps those that are withdrawing from it and need to come back up to baseline. But if you never use it and haven't used it, you get very little, if any, benefit from the caffeine. Well, how about acid reflux? Unfortunately, caffeine causes acid reflux and can cause reflux esophagitis, which is a big problem that I see. And people say, well, if you have acid reflux, just take a proton pump inhibitor. That's a medication that we often use. There are a whole class of them actually, and you may have heard the names like omeprazole, otherwise known as Prilosec, or pantoprazole, that's Protonix, or Nexium. There are quite a number of them. There's some concerning data with those, particularly recently, as they seem to increase the risk of people that get COVID-19 infection for a severe infection, particularly if they're taken in high dose. So generally, I don't recommend caffeine for people that have problems with reflux. In fact, it's something you want to avoid. The same is true with gastric ulcers. If you have a history of ulcers, you'll want to minimize caffeine intake. There is no strong evidence of caffeine and its effect on cancer, so that's one thing that we can let go of, worries about that. There is some data on osteoporosis and caffeine intake. Caffeine intake in middle age doesn't seem to adversely affect bone density, but particularly in older women, if they have a cup or two of coffee a day, it seems to accelerate osteoporosis. But there's another question that I think is even more important, and that is, what is the direct effect of caffeine on your body? What is it that makes you feel that pickup? Well, we know what it is. It increases your adrenaline level and your noradrenaline level, or your epinephrine level. Well, what's epinephrine? Epinephrine is that chemical that's secreted into our nervous system that gives us that fight or flight impulse. If someone walked into your house this evening and pulled a gun out and said, I'm going to kill you, what would happen? Well, your pulse would go up, your breathing would go up, you'd get ready to fight or to run. And caffeine increases the fight or flight in us. It makes us more emotional. We respond more emotionally, just like you would in that setting, rather than keeping us calm and level. Now, the good news is over time you have less of an effect. You remember just a few minutes ago I mentioned what happened to me when I had my first cup of coffee about 15 years ago, and my last since then. I became very talkative and just couldn't stop. That probably wouldn't have happened to me every time I took coffee, because there's some dependence or tolerance developed when you drink it every day. But you still get a bump in the adrenaline levels. If 90% of Americans are drinking caffeinated beverages every day, what do you think that does to our society? Are we more eager to fight? Are our emotional impulses a little less under control? There's some really interesting things to think about in that area. If you look around you today, yes, we're in the middle of a pandemic, but how about politics? Has there been a little more fighting and shall we say, pugilism in politics than you'd like to see? Perhaps we should pass a law that no politician can drink any caffeinated beverage. Maybe we'd have more cooperation and collaboration. And how about our communities? It would be an interesting study. I don't think anyone's done it, but I think our society might benefit from a little less adrenaline running around in our veins. And I would encourage you to think about that. I don't recommend coffee drinking because I think there are other ways to get those antioxidants, and I think we certainly have enough anxiety and enough argumentative style in our culture today. And with 90% of our population drinking this stuff, it's no wonder that we're not getting along a little bit better. Well, let's go to another topic, and that is milk. I have several types of milk here today, and people often ask me, well, what's the best kind? Well, cow's milk is excellent. It's a wonderful source of calories. It's a great source of protein, particularly for baby calves. For the rest of us, it's probably not as good. Mother's milk is certainly good for human babies if it's human mother's milk. We are, interestingly, the only mammal that drinks milk into adulthood on a regular basis. I don't recommend cow's milk for several reasons. One, it has been shown to increase risk of breast cancer in women and increase risk of prostate cancer in men. And those studies go back to 2001 for prostate cancer in men. Harvard published a study showing a marked increased risk of prostate cancer. And you say, well, what about calcium in milk, and don't we need that? Yes, but there are other sources of calcium. And interestingly, the countries with the highest intakes of milk from cattle or from cows have the highest rates of osteoporosis. So it doesn't seem to work out well that if we drink cow's milk, it helps our bones. So I don't recommend the cow's milk. What about other milks? Well, I have several kinds here. We have organic coconut milk and almond milk and oat milk and soy milk and cashew milk. And I looked over all of the ingredient list and the nutrition facts on these, and it's interesting the difference. We'll start with soy milk, and there are various kinds of soy milk. I'm not here to advertise one brand over another. I asked my wife to pick some up, and she picked these up. If you look at the nutrition facts on the back of the soy milk, you'll notice one thing that's very interesting, and that is they're very rich in fiber. Soy milk, by and large, will have the most fiber of any of the plant-based milks. And this one has 2 grams of dietary fiber per cup and 1 gram of carbohydrates. So it has a great carb-fiber ratio. It has 4 grams of total fat, but it's very low in saturated fat, which is good. If you compare that to coconut milk, the calories in this coconut milk here are actually lower than the calories in the soy milk, but it's almost all fat. The total fat is 4.5 grams, and 4 of those grams are saturated fat. And as you know, saturated fat can cause some problems like increasing your cholesterol, increasing your risk of heart disease, and it increases insulin resistance and can cause diabetes. So I don't recommend, as a general rule, coconut milk. Occasionally I think it would be fine, but if you're going to use a milk on a regular basis, and I don't really recommend drinking it, but if you're going to use it on your cereal in the morning, I'd recommend the soy over the coconut, although the coconut certainly tastes good. And then we come to almond milk. The interesting thing about almond milk is the calories are much lower than the soy milk, I should say. But there's very little fiber in it, less than 1 gram of fiber. So you absorb the calories a little bit faster. But I think it's a good milk, there's no problem. And this is an unsweetened milk, and so the sugars in this are actually quite low. And then we come to an oat milk, and there are various kinds of oat milk, but this one has a lot of sugar added. It has 7 grams of sugar added per serving, which is a lot, and I haven't tasted this, but I'll bet this is really sweet tasting. I'm sure there are oat milks that are made with very little sugar, but the point I'd like to make is read the labels here. Very, very important. And then we have the cashew milk, and this cashew milk is unsweetened, and the fat is actually quite low in this. It has 2 grams of total fat, which is about the same as the soy milk. And it looks like a great product. The dietary fiber, however, in this is 0, which is interesting. They have filtered out all of the fiber in the cashews. So I would recommend that primarily if you're going to use a plant-based milk, that you try to get one that's unsweetened and avoid the ones that have a lot of sugar added. And also look at the saturated fat and make sure it's not too high. You may have some questions after I finish about milks, and I'd be happy to talk with you about them a little bit more then. The next topic that I'd like to talk to you about is alcohol. This is something that unfortunately more and more people during this pandemic are drinking. The alcohol intake has gone way up, and that's a problem. There is some research that shows that alcohol is actually beneficial for health in small amounts, but not for everyone. And the problem is it's hard sometimes to drink small amounts. Some people, once they have a small amount, they soon have a large amount. So let's look at the risk overall. If you look at, let's say, less than 7 drinks a week. If you have less than 7 drinks a week, but more than, you have 1 to 7 drinks a week, it will increase your cancer risk. So even 1 drink a week increases cancer risk. It will decrease your risk of stroke and heart attack, and 1 to 7 drinks seems to reduce dementia risk as well. Well, those are all important, and I'd like to reduce my risk of stroke and heart attack and dementia, but is there a way I can do it without increasing my cancer risk? You know, I don't want to partake in an activity that helps one thing and worsens another, and I'm not sure that increasing my cancer risk is worth it to lower my risk of heart disease. So that's not very good. And then if you get up to 7 to 14 drinks or more, you not only increase cancer risk, but then you're increasing stroke risk, you're increasing heart failure risk, and you're increasing dementia risk. So there's a dose here that if you get it just right, you'll decrease some risks, but still increase others. I don't recommend alcohol for health because of that, and certainly not if you're drinking more than 1 to 2 drinks a day. Now, why do I say 1 to 2? Women and men process alcohol differently. That's because women's body fat is slightly higher, and their ability to metabolize alcohol is lower. So more than 7 drinks a week for women, or more than 14 drinks for men a week, definitely adversely affects all levels of health. There's no benefit to it. We know now that if women have 7 or more and men have 14 or more, their average life expectancy is reduced, not extended. And if you go to 14 or more, it's reduced markedly. And if you go to 25 or more, then you're cutting years off the life. So you have to be very careful with alcohol, and I think the best bet is to avoid it entirely. People say, well, what about red wine and the French paradox? Well, if you really want to get the resveratrol, you can get it from grapes instead of wine, and then you get more benefits than you do from the alcohol itself. So I don't think there's any reason that we have to drink alcohol. Lastly, water. Water is the best drink. You can drink it between meals without any problem. Drinking it with your meal isn't the best. It dilutes the digestive juices and you don't tend to chew your food as well. What's the best time to drink water? Probably 15 to 30 minutes before your meal, and then about 2 hours after your meal is ideal. If you want to drink it close to your meal, I recommend that you drink it warm so that you don't chill your body before you eat. You absorb the water a little better that way. You say, well, I don't like warm water. Well, put a squeeze of lemon in it. That helps if you do that. And there aren't hardly any calories added, as Cheryl's drinks demonstrated. Those are very low calorie. So I think that, as far as timing, is the best time to drink water. I don't recommend you drink cold water or iced water unless you're overheated, because that tends to chill the body. It's much better to drink that water at room temperature or body temperature. What about vitamin water, flavored water, carbonated water? I think it's better to get your vitamins from a natural source rather than depending on someone else to add the right amounts and the right kinds. If the water is flavored with a non-caloric flavorer, I don't mind that. I think it's fine. And carbonated water is fine as well if you want to have a little zing to your water. Some people wonder if tap water is okay, and I guess the answer in this part of the country is yes, but in Flint, Michigan, a few years ago, the answer would have been no. So if you're getting your water from a source, from a city water, you might want to check with them and make sure that the water is indeed pure. Bottled water is fine, but again, there's questions about what kind of a bottle it's in and whether that plastic is good for you or not. Certainly it's not good for the environment, and so I tend to shy away from bottled water because of the plastic. We're swimming in plastic in our world today, and I think it's better for that reason to avoid it. Spring water can be excellent, so can well water, but if you have those, you might want to get them tested, particularly in Maine. Well water, it's often good to test it for arsenic because that's a problem here in Maine. You can filter your water, and I think that's excellent. And there are several filters that are certainly affordable on the market that you can get. So I would encourage you to drink water. How much should you drink? Well, if you don't have a medical problem like congestive heart failure or a problem retaining sodium in your body, the general rule of 6 to 8 glasses of water a day is a good rule of thumb. More if you're larger, less if you're smaller, more if you're sweating. The easiest way to tell is to observe your urine. If the urine is light yellow in color, then you're doing about right. If it gets darker, you need to drink more water. You know, I think of it this way: when I'm doing dishes at home, I like to rinse them, and I don't want that water looking murky when I'm washing the dishes. I like it to be, you know, nice and clean, and you can think of your urine as rinse water, and you want your rinse water to not be too dirty, because if it is, so are you, and we don't want that. And now if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take those.
We do have a couple questions. I want to circle back a little bit though to the milk. Dr. Howe mentioned soy milk. So whenever we're drinking soy milk, we always want to make sure that it is
organic. The reason is soy is grown, much of the soy is grown using glyphosate or Roundup, and I don't recommend that because, as we've spoken here before, glyphosate was first marketed as a boiler cleaner, and that is, it works as a chelator and chelates minerals. Secondly, it was marketed as an antibiotic and then as a weed killer, and when we consume it, it's really hard on our gut. It works as an antibiotic there and unbalances the microbiome, and many people think they have a soy allergy when actually their problem is the glyphosate in the soy. So organic when you're dealing with soy, whether it's soy milk or tofu or any other form of soy.
for folks who are not drinking with their meals. How long before and after a meal should they wait to drink?
Okay, ideally, you want to make sure that you consume your water at least 15 to 30 minutes before the meal. Interestingly, those of you who are trying to lose weight, if you have a nice big drink of water 30 minutes before your meal, say 16 ounces of water before your meal, you'll notice that you don't tend to overeat. Often we confuse thirst and hunger, and so we eat when we really need to drink. And if you front load with water 30 minutes before the meal, it's much easier to distinguish the hunger from the thirst. And if you satisfied your thirst, you don't tend to overeat.
Very good. Another question was about, at one time we were encouraged to drink 8 glasses of water a day. Is that still true?
Yeah, that's still true, but you'd want to drink more if you're more than 70 kilos. Another way to look at it is about a half an ounce of water per pound. So if you weighed 120 pounds, you'd want 60 ounces of water. And that's a little higher estimate, but it works really well. Again, remember, if you have congestive heart failure, talk to your doctor first. Or if you're one of those people who has trouble concentrating your urine and your serum sodium tends to run low, you may have to restrict water intake, but it's always healthier, if you can, to drink adequate water. And the rule of thumb of 8 glasses a day is still good, except perhaps in the elderly, 6 to 8 would be better.
And last question, are there any negatives to drinking sparkling water infused with CO2?
I don't think there are any negatives that we know of. Carbon dioxide, or CO2, is what we exhale every time we take a breath in. We get oxygen in, we exhale, we get carbon dioxide out. And I haven't found anything in the medical literature that's negative with that, other than if you drink that, you will belch more. And if you have problems with acid reflux, that may trigger that and cause more problems. So that's the one caveat with drinking carbonated beverages.
So our drink of choice is?
Water.
Water, water, water.
Yeah. Again, remember that drinking with meals is not best, and drinking drinks between meals with calories is not best. So I think one of the best things you can do is to have like an herb tea, some of the drinks that Cheryl showed in the evening. Ideally, if you're overweight, you'll have 2 meals a day, eat a good solid breakfast, a good lunch, And then for supper, instead of having a sit-down meal, you still like to have time together to talk. I think it's excellent to have a hot drink, particularly in the winter. And if you had a touch of sweetener in there, honey or maple syrup, that would be fine. Just want to minimize that.